So I have two questions about this, and maybe you can clear this up. How was the gunman able to get into the school if the resource officer had engaged with him but no gunfire was exchanged? How did he get in?
Yeah, so it started at his home. You know, he tragically shoots his grandmother, and then he gets in a vehicle and he drives to the school. It's less than a mile away, so it's really right around the corner. And as he comes to the school, he wrecks. He kind of goes into this ditch, and it's when he got into that ditch is when law enforcement was called and engaged. You know, so that's part of the initial contact. It was no firing that I understand. He actually enters through the back of one of the buildings, through the teacher parking lot, if you will. He immediately enters one room, and then essentially that's when the police, the law enforcement officer, because it's not just police officers, it's sheriffs, it's Border Patrol agents. I mean, everybody came together. People are not even in this county, and they basically cornered him into one room. There are hundreds of children in that school. Part of the story, there's a lieutenant named Javier Martinez engages this assailant. He takes fire. He actually was wounded. You know, it's tragic to see so many children be murdered, but this could have been a whole lot worse. People like Javier Martinez and Chief Arredondo, they saved hundreds of lives. So that's where you see him get pinned in.
Well, he was pinned, but just to be clear, he's pinned down or pinned in a classroom where he was slaughtering kids, right? I mean, is that what you mean by pinned down?
I understand that he went in that classroom and he begins to fire. He begins to murder people, starting with that wonderful teacher that was defending her students, and he doesn't stop. The police officer actually engages him. Javier Martinez engages him. He kind of takes fire through the door, and then it stops, and he barricades himself in. That's where there's kind of a lull in the action. All of it, I understand, lasted about an hour. But this is where there's kind of a 30-minute lull. They feel as if they got him barricaded in. The rest of the students in the school are now leaving. You know, they're trying to get people out to safety, and this assailant is barricaded in. It's moments later or minutes later when they breach it, and then ultimately a Border Patrol agent is the one that neutralizes this assailant.
All right. It still seems like a lot of time that the police were outside the classroom and the shooter was inside the classroom where there were kids.
Okay, Tess, there's a lot there that people are going to be frustrated by. What does it mean to engage someone? It seems like a careful avoidance of the word, shot at. We've discovered that the person was not wearing the protective gear that he was initially represented as having worn. How do we end up here? And can you unpack a little bit how the information has been trickling out and why there was so much misunderstanding yesterday?
So the timeline is all over the place, and they cannot seem to get their story straight of what happened. I started out yesterday trying to just sort of build a simple timeline of, the facts of the time that he arrived at school, the time that he in quote engaged with a particular officer. The version of events that I had understood it yesterday following the press conference was that 11:20. He texted the girl that morning saying that he was going to kill his grandmother. 11:20, he texts that girl saying that he had shot his grandmother in the head and that he was going to shoot up an elementary school. His grandmother reportedly called 911, but I'm not sure when that was. He got in his truck, drove a short distance to the school, turned into a ditch that was sort of adjacent to school property. I looked at it on Google Earth. It's about sort of a width of a football field, maybe 100 yards away from school buildings. Someone called 911 to report the crash, and then this is where it gets fuzzy. DPS Director Steve McCraw said yesterday at the press conference held by Texas officials that there was a school resource officer who had learned about the 911 reports and saw him and attempted to confront him and maybe had engaged him, but that was very unclear. The gunman went inside anyway, and from what I understood, then a few more officers then showed up, and that there was some exchange of gunfire, and numerous people with DPS had said that those officers sustained injuries. And then this gets to the bit where the shooter ends up in the classroom. Governor Greg Abbott had described the classroom as one that was internally connected to another classroom. Some DPS spokespersons had said that he had barricaded himself in there. McCraw used language which gave me pause, which was that he said twice that the police have been responsible for containing the shooter in a classroom. So my question after seeing that was, was the classroom empty? Were there children in the classroom that he was contained into? And how long was he in that classroom? Mm-hmm. And that's what we're starting to learn a bit more. We know from AP's reporting, for example, that police have set up a perimeter around the school and that there were these, anguished scenes of parents who wanted to go in there and feeling like the police weren't doing enough. And the Texas officials have been very opaque with the timeline, with how long. I think they said, 40 to an hour that it went on for.
Right, and at no point has anyone suggested that the classroom he was pinned in was empty, and we know the victims were all from the same classroom, so that suggests that in fact he was pinned there with the victims. So the idea that it would take so long to get the door open, like as people are being murdered in real time, look, it is what it is, but the way it's being spun immediately as some triumph of law enforcement coordination and resources, like by that guest Jake Tapper was interviewing, when no, at the least it looks like that was not a great thing to have him trapped or whatever in that classroom. That's where the people were being killed. Obviously, and then we're starting to see footage of people outside wanting to go in and help the police, and maybe it's not a good idea for them to do that, but the police, instead of trying to get this door open, trying to track down an employee, how could that take an hour to track down an employee who can open this door when they're putting more effort into keeping people from intervening? I think that's going to very reasonably make people quite upset to learn if that was the case, that's what was going on.
I also think, just the timeline, I've covered a lot of mass shootings, unfortunately, in the last few years, and school shootings in particular as well. And, details are always a little fuzzy. Narratives can shift, but one thing that often is quite consistent is time. They can say pretty clearly when the shooting started, when it stopped, when police arrived on scene, when a shooter was taken into custody or killed. Those are details that are usually pretty stable. And so the fact that we're not really getting a clear time that, they're saying, the shooter arrived in the school and then a tactical unit arrived and killed the shooter. But what they're not saying is that an hour passed in that time frame, and they're not saying what happened in that hour. So I think that's going to be something that is going to be heavily scrutinized, I hope, in the days and weeks to come.